Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure for me to be here. And I'll share with you a little bit about why that is. But one of them is that my whole life, beginning in high school and college, I began to believe that there was this thing called public service. But they actually didn't have graduate programs and easy pathways to think about working between the government, the nonprofit, and the private sectors. And here we are today, and you truly are the agents of change when I think about the world ahead of us. Without change makers and without public service and without the commitment that you're making, life would be very different. But it will be great because of you. So it's a privilege to be here in Little Rock. Tonight, what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you a little bit about the book format, Take Me With You, and then, if you will, the origins of the book, and my own childhood story, and a little bit about what I think the meaning is for the impact on my work today, but also the impact of your work. There's another hero in the audience that's been recognized, Pierre Ferrari. I got a chance to be with Heifer today. They're one of the charities that we get a privilege to raise a little bit of money for, but he has to raise a lot more to help the livelihoods of women and families around the world. So, Pierre, thank you for being here. So, the book format. It's a little bit unusual, actually. It begins and continues with a childhood story, which is really set in the context of the late 1960s. And it's all about race, religion, and family in the 60s and 70s. But it also, after each childhood chapter, it has an essay around the global development goals for sustainability and the work that international nonprofits, public sector, foundations like the Clinton Foundation and many others are doing to make great progress around the world, including Heifer. And I wanted to just share a slide about those global development goals, because tonight I'll probably talk a little bit more about the childhood story. But it's important, I think, for all of us to kind of think about why knowing our own personal story is so important. I was speaking to a group of CEOs in New York about 2 years ago, and it was during the time in which I was hoping to kind of publish the book. And staff didn't have time to prepare my remarks. So I went a bit off script and I told my childhood story. And you could hear a pin drop. And afterwards, I thought, I wish, the publisher and the agent should have heard this, because they realized that someone might read this story. And sure enough, actually that same day, I got an email saying that a publisher was interested, but only if I would make a connection of this childhood story to literally the Global Development Goals, which is what I've been speaking on earlier in the day. And it made me realize that for all of us, we have to make some sort of personal connection. It doesn't matter what our backgrounds have been, what our histories have been, but if we don't think about our own story and how that got us to this graduate program, how it got us to the work that we're in today, the organization that we're a part of, and what change in the world we want to be our own legacy, our own social impact, then we'll never get there. And I think what's fabulous is that we have these 17 global development goals, and we've now just had the second anniversary of these goals. And if you think about it, the progress the world has made, because we don't hear that much about the good things every day in the press, but the progress has been fantastic. One of my favorites is the fact that in 2000, more than 12 million children died every year from preventable diseases. And today, just over 4 million die every year from preventable diseases. Still horrific, but the progress is fantastic. The number of women who give childbirth and live is now greater than those who die in the developing world. And the areas that Heifer is so involved with, whether it's in sustainability or it is in education or in gender equity, but what's really important is the world, there's fewer people dying from hunger than there were again 15 years ago. And what's also fantastic is that the number of people that live under $2 a day has been significantly reduced from, roughly 2 billion to now 700 million a year. Big numbers still, but we can see the progress. Polio is close to being eradicated. There's tremendous progress in the world, but it's so important, I think, that we're not only diligent to the work ahead, but that we realize, again, that the work continues because we make a personal connection to a cause, to a community, whether that's here in Little Rock or whether that's someplace else around the world, and then we do something about it. So I hope that this childhood story helps you think about your own story and how you choose to use that story to change the world. So the book is called Take Me With You, and the title comes from the fact that my mother, who was an abused spouse, every day when she would try to escape that situation, I would say, "Take me with you." And eventually she did, and she left that situation. And then she married a Black Baptist minister in 1968 named Reverend Jefferson Jackson. Jefferson had an 8th grade education, but was an amazing person. And they actually couldn't get married in Kansas because that was still, that year, finally in '69, the state of law in Kansas allowed for mixed marriages. So they went to Nebraska and got married. I was very irritated that they came back one weekend and they were married. But the interesting thing about this is that both sides had a difficult time with this. So my mother, who is the first integrated teacher of the high school of Bonner Springs, lost her job, and Jefferson lost his church, and we then had a custody battle in which we were losing that, and they were going to lose custody of me. My biological father was embarrassed by the situation and so had filed a custody battle. But I want to share a little bit with you about what it was like as a kid in that kind of an environment. And I'll do 2 or 3 readings tonight, but they'll be short. The setup for this one is that as a small child, some of the things that I remember is that my mother, all she wanted to be was a great wife. And she was so proud to be the wife of a pastor. My biological father was also a pastor. And so it was so disturbing that the one thing that she wanted to be, she couldn't be, either because she wasn't good enough or because it wasn't working out or because of the times. So this one night, we had worked hard, the 2 of us, in this little parsonage in Edwardsville, Kansas, where we lived, and my biological father preached. And we had prepared this great roast dinner, with carrots and potatoes and everything else. And I was just barely old enough to even remember all of it, but I do. And I remember setting the table in the little living room because we didn't have a dining room. And so we thought everything was going to be just perfect. I remember another day around this time when Mom and I spent hours preparing a roast for dinner. I remember feeling excited about Dad coming home. The smell of meat and vegetables and potatoes filled the parsonage. Shortly after Dad arrived, he began yelling when he noticed that the cans of food in the kitchen cabinet were out of order. "You can't even keep the cabinet neat," he said nastily. "Well, I've made you dinner," Mom replied. "Yeah, well, you can't even keep this kitchen clean. We need to clean up this mess." "You can clean it up, but we're going to eat." Dad threw one of the cans down and screamed, "I'm not going to eat till this is all cleaned up." Mom proceeded to empty the entire cabinet onto the floor. "Go to hell," she said. She threw the silverware drawer at him and tried to run past. Dad rushed past Mom after he pushed her across the room and began to shake her. As Mom fought back, screams filled the house. I began to cry uncontrollably. Dad's strength and weight overpowered Mom easily. Chaos filled the house. I'd been sitting at our tiny card table with silverware. I said, "Stop it, stop it." I covered my ears with my hands to try to drown out the noise. I still had a fork in my hand. The next thing I knew, I was banging the large carving fork against an upright piano in the living room. Ivory shards flew from the piano keys with each clang of the fork. Suddenly, Mom ran through the living room. Dad chased her. His rage bulged from his neck and temples in thick veins. Mom slammed the bathroom door. Dad pounded on it with both fists. We never did eat dinner Mom had so lovingly prepared. For the rest of our lives together, the broken piano keys reminded me of that night and when the facade of our happy home abruptly ended. So it was difficult times. Jefferson and my father actually were the co-chairs of the first black and white ministerial alliance of Kansas City in 1968. And after the divorce, my biological father said, "Well, why don't you just go get counseling? You're crazy. Get counseling from someone like Jefferson Jackson." So she did, and they fell in love. And that's how they came together, and all heck broke loose then. But we believed that we were supposed to be together, and my mother stayed true to her word to take me with her. And so we knew we were losing the custody battle, so we decided that we would have to leave. And so we got on an airplane the same day as the final court decision and made our way to Vancouver, British Columbia. We didn't have work permits, so we couldn't stay long. So we made our way on the ferry system, and we're going to go to a quiet border crossing on the Olympic Peninsula, a place called Port Angeles, Washington. And on that ferry crossing, there was a gentleman with a felt hat, a Canadian, who came up to us. He saw the three of us. We were quite a sight. Maps in those days, trying to figure out where we were going to go. My mom had this poodle named Trixie that Jefferson had given her in her purse, so we were quite the sight. And he said, "You folks ought to think about this place called Sequim, Washington, Sequim. There's people from all over the world that are writing and going there, retiring there, and they would accept you." And he walked off. So we got off the ferry, had a hard time getting a taxi, a hard time getting a hotel room, but better than Kansas. And we then made our way to a small horse ranch in the mountains near Sequim, Washington, and it was better. And so we were there, and I didn't enter the school system for roughly a year, was homeschooled, finally re-entered the school system, and somewhere along the line had given my real name. And so one day the authorities showed up and held me in detention, took me to the detention center, held my mother for kidnapping, and she was arrested separately. And then there was a court trial the next morning, and I was escorted back to the state of Kansas to live with my mom, with my father. So those were difficult days for me. There was a tremendous amount of anger. I was not, a great kid during this time. I had a lot of anger, first because of the situation, and then anger because I thought I had picked my mom and Jefferson, and now that was all gone. And then the anger came again because I wasn't allowed to have any contact with my mom. And so I didn't know what had happened. And I knew that each day that the memories were fading. And so I was angry with her and Jefferson because they'd left me, they'd abandoned me. I'd chosen them, and yet I didn't know where they were. So one day we were in Edwardsville in this small little post office, and I could see that my dad, he was inside. It was beginning to snow. It was actually the beginning of a blizzard in Kansas. And he was getting the mail, and I went in to see what was going on, and I could see her name. And I said, "That's my letter," and he wouldn't let me have it. And so we wrestled with it, and when we finally got to the house, I tried to get it as best I could, and we fought, and I lost that battle. And he took the letter away with him. And then a little while later, he came back and threw the letter at me and said, look, there's nothing in this. You can have it if you want. And there are 3 words in that letter, and they said, I love you. And I knew that for whatever reason, my mom wanted to be in contact with me, but she couldn't. And so I grabbed my green knit hat that a woman in church in Sequim had knitted and had $20 bills sewn inside the linings of it, and my Bible with phone numbers across the country, both of which Jefferson and Sydney had given me at the detention center. And then I grabbed perhaps something just as important, my deflated basketball, gotta have that, and asked if I could go out and play in the snow. It was really bad. It was a real storm. I went back 30 years later and traced it with the weather, and it was pretty significant. And he said, yes, that's fine. So I went out and I started my journey in my tennis shoes and with my basketball. And I didn't know where I was going to go, but I kept going. And made it for the first few miles. We lived on a church camp. And so it was in the woods. It was, to the chapel. It was each kind of milestone. I kept thinking, am I really doing this, or do I need to turn back? And finally, I got to the cliff above the Kansas River, which I'd been to many times, but had never gone any further. And I made my way down the cliff and into a field that was covered with snow, and sure enough, got a thorn right through the foot. So then I had to try to get that out and get the shoe back on. And then I made my way across the field and across the road on the other side of the berm of the river, not unlike the berm of the Arkansas River. And I just want to share with you a little bit about what happened next. I arrived at the road and crossed straight to the other side. A thin strip of land separated the street from the railroad berm and tracks. Up and over, I disappeared on the other side of the embankment. A narrow band of trees ran along the riverbank. Through it, I heard the soft lapping of the water against the shore. I was exactly where I wanted to be. The rail berm hid me from the road. I could follow the tracks to DeSoto, which is the next little town that I was trying to get to. This was my territory, the exact kind of spot I spent endless hours when back in Edwardsville. I roamed the north shore of the same river, the same tracks. A faint glow of light hung low in the distant sky. Catching my breath, I thought about Mom and Jefferson. What would they think if they knew where I was? The cold air snapped me back into the present day. There was only one way to get to DeSoto, the Wyandotte Street Bridge. I reached up and touched my hat. I felt the money sewn inside. The snowfall had nearly stopped, and a cold wind blew, undiluted, down the tracks. I pulled the hat tight over my ears. My left foot still stung. I didn't know how long it would take, how I would connect to the next place I was to go. But I knew I needed to get there first, to DeSoto. I started jogging east along the edge of the tracks. The snow cover was lighter here than in the field, and after a few minutes, the tracks crossed a small stream. From here, it was about 1.5 miles to Wyandotte. I kept moving along the bottom of the berm, watching for debris in the near darkness. The sound of an engine startled me. It came from the road. I stopped. Whoever it was, they were driving slowly. I lowered my body and climbed the rail berm. In the distance, I saw flashing red and blue police lights. I kept my head to the tracks and watched as the car moved closer. What are they doing? Are they looking for me? The answer seemed obvious. I then continued to make my way, but a little bit slower. and thought I needed to maybe turn back, because at this point, if my father caught me, it would be difficult, and the police were looking for me. Do I continue? But I began to walk toward the light, keeping a few yards off the street and hugging sparse hedge groves. As I did, I found myself humming a song Jefferson had taught me. We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in his holy word. He's never failed us yet. Oh, we can't turn back. We've come this far by faith. I knew I was doing the right thing. Even if I got caught, I had to get back to Mom and Jefferson. They'd given up almost everything. They had to escape with me the first time. I owed it to them to get back. So I did continue. In fact, the next amazing thing was that once I got up onto this road, this bridge I had to cross, a truck came across the bridge, and I hailed it down, having no idea whether this was friend or foe. And a man who I'll never knew again, said, "Where are you heading?" in the middle of a snowstorm, 12-year-old kid. And I said, "I just need to get across the bridge." He said, "Okay, great, get in." He took me across the bridge, and I got out. He never asked any questions. But it's been people like that, every day that have changed my lives, even if I didn't know their names, right? Many years later, I was in Uganda, northern Uganda, and there was a terrible war that was happening there. Many of you, I think, probably know of it, but the Lord's Liberation Army, quite the villain, Kony, wreaked havoc on northern Uganda, and over 1 million people were in camps at one point. And you may have heard of the invisible children. So the children, the night walkers, who had to walk at night to be able to get out of their villages and safely into the compounds of the capital, Gulu. And then each morning they would walk back so that they could have breakfast with their families and go to school. And I was there with a group of donors and other stakeholders for World Vision. And World Vision ran a rehabilitation center for women and children who were maimed from this war. It was a very vicious war in which limbs were cut off and women were left to die. And World Vision would take these women and children in and try to make sure they had a different life. In fact, I'll read just a moment of this book, and then I want to share with you how this impacted my own career. Kony was known for raiding villages before dawn, abducting young boys into submission to become soldiers, raping girls, forcing them into slavery until he discarded them later on the trail, beaten to death or maimed beyond recognition. And beatings alone didn't suffice. The LLA has made its mark by lopping off arms, legs, breasts, noses, and ears of the victims. They especially practice these brutal methods of control on young girls. To avoid these atrocities, the families in the surrounding villages and region encourage their children to make their way into the city of Gulu, where the United Nations and participating international organizations maintain secure compounds with separate makeshift barracks for the boys and girls. The night walkers, as these school-aged children are known, make their way into the city before dusk to study by floodlights, sleep, and then by first light of dawn, return to their families for a meal of meager proportions. So we were there, and that evening there was more activity in the war than often there was, and all of a sudden the streets began to fill, and there were thousands of children surrounding our group of donors from the United States. In fact, to a point where it was a bit scary. You didn't know what was going on, and lost each other in the crowds. And then I realized that somebody was tugging on my hand, and I reached down, and a little girl who looked up to me grabbed my hand, and she told me her name was Rose. And she looked at me and she said, "Take me with you." And I knew at that moment that each and every one of us are somebody's Rose and somebody's way to a better future. And so for me, when I think about my own story, it's about choosing the charity within. It's about deciding that the anger will not overwhelm you, that the negative is not going to take you over, but rather that there's something positive in life, no matter what the circumstances, and that it's all of our job to find that and to remember that every day there's somebody that's going to be impacted by what we do and by whether or not we choose the charity within. So this is a special group for me, the dean, the school, all of you, because you've chosen the charity within and the greater community of Little Rock for having the school here. And I just want to thank you for what you do every day, and thank you for letting me be here to share.
All right, so we got a great class of high school students here. We've got Clinton School students here, and we've got community members here. Let's have questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity for us to come over. What is the biggest challenge regarding work in the developing world as far as charity? We just finished Nicholas Kristof's book, A Path to Peers, and so everyone here is kind of well-versed on Kristof's theories and such, but what, in your own work, do you feel is the biggest challenge?
Yes. Well, I think I'm a bit biased, but I think that continuing to have the resources, both not only financial, but skills that we bring to each other, right? So, and making sure that we're partnering in those skills and resources. I mean, Heifer has a lot of amazing partners, but if they can't get them the resources and get to them and give them the support they need, then they won't be self-sufficient. But if they can, they will be. So I think it's less about any one issue, including just resources or just expertise or education or corruption. I think it's about continuing to get not only key resources, but partnerships so that people can take control, of their own destinies and not giving up.
Okay. Come on. Yes. Okay. Harriet, right here.
I don't want to spoil anything, but can you just tell us, did you make it back? I have to know. I just have to know.
Yes. Yes. So absolutely. So I made my way. It was a bit of a underground railroad. You'll read in the book, but I made my way to DeSoto, and I made my way to an Arabian horse ranch that my grandfather had taken me to once. And his name was Whitey Hughes, and he was actually a Pendergast boy, if any of you remember Teddy Pendergast from Kansas City. And there was a bit of an underground railroad to get me to Omaha, Nebraska. And it was a bit complicated because I was on the news and people were looking for me. So you couldn't get to an airport or anything else. And finally, from Omaha, there was a circuitous effort to get me on a plane finally. You couldn't do that today probably. And what I learned was that Jefferson and Sidney had taken the case to the Supreme Court of the state of Washington and had it overturned. But now it was a civil trial, and so I actually had to be in that state to be able to have a final appeals court hearing. And all of Sequim turned out for it, and I was able to then stay with my mom in Jefferson. And he wanted to adopt me, but that actually cost a lot of money. So we figured out we could go to the courthouse, and for $25 I could change my name. So I changed my name to Jackson. But yes, I made it.
Well, that's a great story. Okay, questions? Come on. There's good. There's good. Is that the first Pulaski Academy student with a question? You win the award. You beat the Clinton School students first, so go ahead.
Can you explain a little bit more about what your charity does?
Yes. So have some of you heard of the United Way? Possibly. So United Way raises funds and visibility, and they were formed many, many years ago, 100 years ago, to do that for domestic charities. Global Impact was formed about 63 years ago to raise funds and visibility for international nonprofits like Heifer. So we make sure that we're supporting Heifer in large-scale workplace giving campaigns and campaigns like Red Nose Day with NBC, and in unique campaigns that raise funds for East Africa famine or for refugees or other key issues. So we don't do the work on the front lines. We're trying to support that work.
Other questions? Yes.
How do you feel about running charities as a business model? So spending more money on advertising or having a lower overhead with higher salaries?
Yeah, so two or three things. One is that one of the reasons why I came to Global Impact is I do believe that the private sector and private philanthropy, that's why I'm so excited why you have the center here, is absolutely essential when we think about these global development goals. This past year, $44 billion went from private philanthropy to developing countries, and only 31 billion actually, went from the US government. So, 15 years earlier, public sector funding, whether it was here in the United States or the United Kingdom or around the world, was the dominant source of funds for development work. And today, as we look ahead, it will be donors like each of us, as well as corporations and the overall private sector that has to get involved. So when I think about that, some of those costs are not going to go away, right? So the importance of getting your name out, letting people know what impact you're having, is going to be important. And I think we have to not think about it as overhead. Sometimes Rich Stearns, the president of World Vision, would say, boy, if I could run a corporation, he used to be the president of Lennox China and Hartman Luggage. And he said, if I could run a corporation that had, 70, 80% profit margin, that'd be amazing. Because that's, what happens in the nonprofit world. You have 70, 80% of your funds go to your programs. So we think about nonprofits, I think, in a little bit too restricted way, because we think about X percentage or Y. We don't think about the impact that we're having. But I do believe it'll cost money to raise money, and that probably won't go away.
Yes, sir, right here, and then we'll get to you after here.
Do you have any concerns relative to the change in the tax laws on the impact of giving to charities in general?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, first of all, I think there's a lot of unknowns. Because, of course, the new structure will mean that there's less need to itemize for many, many Americans. And I think what will be interesting to watch is, first of all, globally, we've seen private philanthropy really emerge around the world. In fact, it's probably not very well known, but whether it's been HIV/AIDS or especially polio, the role of private philanthropy from the Middle East and other parts of the world has been really important, almost a matching set of dollars to the Gates Foundation, the US government, and others involved in this. And I think that what's interesting about that is that growth has happened without the tax deductibility. So as we think ahead, I think people will think a lot more about the social impact they want to have in the world, and does philanthropy help them do that, as opposed to the tax deduction being the driving force. It'll still be important, but it looks like globally it's not as important as we think it might have been. Secondly is that it'll be interesting because it may help certain mechanisms like the Donor Advice Fund, where you can have your own personal foundation. We've actually created a Donor Advice Fund for every person with no minimum, and this is where you can give more in a given year, but you can spend it then as you get involved, with Heifer or other organizations. I think those kind of mechanisms would allow people to deduct some years and not deduct other years. So I think it'll certainly have an impact, but my hope is that it does not slow down philanthropy, because I think the private philanthropy will be so important, around the world.
Yes, we had a question back there. Then we'll come over there.
Do you think our current model of charity has an adverse effect in developing nations at all?
Well, I think that I think the days in which you think that you can run programs and do everything from the United States or the UK or even South Africa, those days are gone. I think that there's still a role to play for international nonprofits, but that it's all about supporting civil society in those countries. So I think that charities that might have been focused on having to bring everything to the work they do, whether it's a community here in Arkansas or around the world, those days hopefully are being replaced by the days of partnering with local communities and supporting, them taking the lead on that and supporting their local-based solutions. That's why I had a chance to tour Heifer today, and why I love the fact they don't just talk about the problems, they talk about the solutions with their partners.
We've got a bunch of questions right here. Look, this back table, we got all hands up. Professor, the PA students are wearing us out and doing it in a very good way. Good for you guys. Go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned the difference between running charity work internationally versus domestically. Do you think there's a difference in the method and how to help out domestically versus across the globe?
Yes. So what I love about the Global Development Goals is they include all of us, right? Gender equality, caring about the environment, eliminating extreme poverty. And we have a lot of work to do in our own country on those issues. How we do it may look a little bit different than how it needs to happen in a developing country setting or a marginalized community setting. And it's hard, many of you have experienced this, but it's hard for us to equate, someone who is trying to get from minimum wage to the next wage level and get the skill sets and the things that they need versus someone who is just trying to figure out how to find water for their family that day. So the needs are both great, but the solutions look a little bit different, and the systems that support those solutions. So I think domestically, we have to take that into account. Having said that, every time I begin to believe that, I realize that there's a countervailing argument. So there are so many communities that do not have access to fresh vegetables in the United States. It's amazing. And you would think that you were literally in Zimbabwe. And so solutions are different, systems are different, but the goals are pretty similar.
All right, just go around the table, Ann, and then we'll
Okay.
I'll try to be more succinct too.
I know at least in Christoph's book, many of the individual success stories had to do with a lot with finding mentors, and I'd say your story was similar. So how important do you think it is for people in similar bad situations to find mentors?
Yes. Well, there have been many mentors for me, including from a distance, President Clinton and many others. But there are key people who help us take a turn, as I call it, to choose the positive. For me, that was Jefferson Jackson. Without Jefferson, he had an 8th grade education. I was constantly irritated with him, the fact that he wanted me to treat my mom right, and I had to listen to him. But the power of him just being there for me and sticking with me, no matter how difficult I was, made me a very different person. So I think there's mentors at different times in life, but I think perhaps more important than even mentoring is your willingness individually to reach your own hand out to someone else. And when someone does that for you, that's the power of mentoring.
Okay, wait, we're going to get to you. We're going one more over here, and then we'll come to this table.
Do you believe that it's easier to raise money for charity by presenting numbers to the audience and statistics, or guilt tripping the audience by showing individual stories and how the area is really affected by whatever the problem is?
Yes. I believe that there's a lot of area in between. So the research clearly shows, it changed about a decade ago, that communications that focus on the negative, on just the problem, actually are not persuasive to donors. So it could have been that we went from TV to more of a social media world, a more connected world, but that those images and just those stories don't drive us to give. It's the positive, it's the progress, but it isn't numbers alone. I do believe that it's not just one fictitious story that we're drawn to, but we are drawn to people that are impacted by whatever we're doing, our own philanthropy and our own engagement.
Right.
As an organization that works to provide funds and visibility to international organizations, what do you view as success in global impact?
Yes. So I view success playing a small role in increasing that number of 44 billion in private philanthropy. If that went up by 1 or 2% every year, our GDP, only 2% of Americans have been giving. Basically 2% of our GDP have been giving for the last 15, 20 years. If Global Impact can help increase that by even 1%, that would be a tremendous success. But secondly is I think that for me and for our organization, we want to be a part of supporting everyday donors. We don't think you have to have $1 million to change the world. We want to see everyday donors continue to find ways to be strategic, to find the right numbers, statistics, to find the right stories. And I think that's going to be the power of what American philanthropy does to democratize itself and democratize the impact that we have around the world.
We have a question right here. Back to that table. I think it's a 7 out of 7 or 8 out of 8. Y'all win the table award, I'll tell you that. Go ahead.
So after reading Nick Kristof's book, Path of Pierce, we learned that like a lot of charities, both nonprofit and for-profit, like took a lot of risks and also experienced like a lot of failures in order to like expand their charity. If you don't mind, do you mind explaining like the risks and failures that your charity experienced in order to help your charity become successful?
Absolutely. So one of the things we did was we did an East Africa fund this fall, and we had 8 international nonprofits that came together. We're having a hard time raising funds for this, and so they asked us to serve as the fundraising and the backbone for the initiative. We didn't have any idea how much we would raise, and so we went out to Google and Facebook ads. It was a consumer facing campaign, and we raised about $5 million. But there was tremendous risk. Those 8 NGOs were going to be extremely disappointed if no funds were raised. Could we ever do another consumer-facing campaign again if this one failed? Would people trust Global Impact to support this kind of initiative? So there are really important risks and willingness to fail that I think you have to do. This Grow Fund that we call the Every Person Foundation, we've just launched it. It's playing on NPR in Washington, D.C., hopefully other NPR areas around the country. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is identified as the first everyday donor program. It could fail. We could be ahead of our time, right? So, absolutely.
Yes, sir, right back here.
It's obvious that I'm not a student.
No, you're lifetime learning.
Well, yeah, well, that's a lie. But I've enjoyed your presentation. But I want to raise the question that we have a president now, a billionaire that has no record of being involved in any way in making this world a better world. More than that, he has expressed this same attitude in the things that he said about some of the other countries, especially people of color. How has this impacted? Now, as a whole, I don't see the impact because Buffett and Gates and some of the others have continued, and they are making tremendous contributions and doing an excellent job. But those of you who are involved directly with this, how has this impact given at this time, and what are your predictions, and what do you see in the future? It's obvious. What bothers me is that our president has a lot of people in America that think just like he thinks. That's what bothers me. If you could shed some light upon that, I'd appreciate it.
Yes. So, first of all, I think we all have to be diligent, because if we care about equality and we care about race relations and many other issues, we have to stand up for what we believe in. As a young child, I had to stand up for what I thought was right. I had to choose my mother and Jefferson. And so I think we all have a personal responsibility to be diligent to our families, to our communities, our country. Secondly is we are diligent in the global development sector because the first year of this administration, there was a significant 30-40% cut recommended for international development funding by the U.S. government. And the U.S. Congress was able to say, no, this progress on these very specific goals is important. And so, but that's only 1 year. And so we'll have to be diligent about keeping the United States in the game. The third thing I worry about is that whenever the noise is so negative and so much fear, then people here in the United States don't think they should engage with the world. And that worries me, because now is the time in which we must engage. But I believe in our millennials and our younger generations, and they're so connected to the world, I just can't imagine that they will disconnect. But that does worry me, is that all the noise crowds out the rest of the world.
Look, I know there are more questions, and I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. So what I'd like for you to do is come visit with him as he sits here and signs this book. I encourage you to Take Me With You. Let's thank Scott Jackson for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. You may have to come over here. You got it.